everyone, and welcome to another episode of WWT Experts. My name is Matthew Nalbone. I'll be your host today as usual. And today we'll be talking with WWT expert Matthew Nalbone about the connected worker. Matt's got to stick together. Matt is a client executive with Worldwide Technology, and he spends most of his time working with our energy companies in the portfolio of clients that we have here at Worldwide Technology. And as such, he's blending together, business needs with lots of technology solutions, primarily in operational technology spaces. But necessarily that means he needs to connect into IT teams as well. So given that, he's got a really interesting point of view about what the connected worker experience is like in today's market. So we're delighted to have him here with us. Please welcome Matthew Nalbone. Matt, good to see you, man.
How are you, Matt?
How was the trip up to St. Louis for you this time?
Uneventful, fortunately.
Well, that's good.
Nice thing was when I got here, there was a lot less people here, 4th of July.
Well, I know you were talking about riding your motorcycle up, which I love the idea of that.
Didn't do that. Didn't want to make the heat.
I'm a motorcyclist too, but it's a little too hot this trip.
It was.
We have to do that another time. Well, thanks for joining us today. And want to jump right into the question set for you. So, what really has brought us to this general idea of the connected worker in general? And how does this align with your experience in oil and gas and in the energy industry in general?
Yeah, I think the driving factors have been trying to just be more efficient, right? There's a loss of love, if you will, for some of the more dirty industries, if you will. So having to change the dynamic on how they get work done, the businesses that they're in, aren't really friendly. They're hazardous. There's a lot of risk involved there. So that's another driving part of it, is just reduce and minimize risk and get people out of hazardous areas. So it's about being more efficient, better use of resources, and reducing risks.
Yeah.
And it's just historically been gravitating towards this type of thing, right? It was empowering workers with being able to gather their own data, but now it's actually immersing them in their environments.
Yeah, and as we think about the connected worker, we're generally thinking more about like someone in an office context, but you're talking about a very different context. So how do you define the idea of connected worker in the client organizations with which you work?
Yeah, the thing is about connected worker, you can ask 10 people and you probably would get 10 different answers to your point about talking about remote work. Right? How do I keep my office workers plugged into the environment and everything going on here? It's not just about a method or methodology. It's about connecting the worker literally with their environment and the things around them, how they interact with temperature data, pressure data, machine data. That's what impacts that connected worker, so they then can respond to those things as needed in real time, as opposed to the delay that typically happens.
Yeah. Well, and I know that, if they can go back sort of a long time ago, the workers that you're talking about, would have been completely unconnected, right? Just out in the field doing the things that they're doing. And over time, that connectivity has increased, which is great. But I'm curious, what are the benefits of that, and how have those benefits accrued over time, as we become more connected in that kind of context?
Yeah, that old time space you're talking about, we like to call analog work, right? It was pen, paper, check, clipboards, people walking around.
Well, and then you have to go back and sort of put that stuff into a computer, probably.
Right, and that still happens, right? That's something that still goes on now, is they go out and they gather the data, they read a meter, they write it all down, they have to go back and put it in a Smartsheet or Excel, and so there's a lot of chance for error. So that's where a lot of the connected worker piece comes into play, is because it minimizes or mitigates that type of error or type of gaps in data entry. Mm-hmm. And where it actually helps is cutting costs. I mean, that's a real big play, is being able to reduce costs, not only in the people impact and the resources you have, but also traveling, right? And then once you reduce traveling, you're now reducing risk. And I don't mean getting on a plane necessarily and coming to St. Louis. It's about just getting in a truck and driving across town or halfway across the state or to 3 different facilities. You're instantly getting benefits on your safety scores. And then those two things coupled together really start helping on the carbon footprint, because I'm using less fuel, less trucks, less paper, right? So all of those things start a confluence of benefits.
Yeah. Well, I want to build on that answer a little bit. So I know that you mentioned many benefits that are happening there. Are organizations have they arrived at a place where they're getting all the benefits yet, or is there still a lot of room to grow to kind of fully realize the benefits that come from using technologies in this context?
Yeah, I think all of the benefits are seen. Are they actually receiving benefits yet? Not necessarily, and that's where the maturity curves come into play, right? How are we leveraging, the technology first, but also the people, right? And it's about changing the culture within an organization that they can start adapting to these new ways of working that makes them the connected worker, because there's always going to be some pushback on adopting these new technologies and new ways of doing work. Because the people that like to always walk around with paper and pens and clipboards don't necessarily adjust well to a headset.
Right. Well, so how are organizations sort of dealing with that, friction with the employees to get them to be willing to adopt these new technologies?
Well, the new technology piece also helps them with new employees, right? Okay. That's the Gen Zers, or whatever we want to call the people that I'm not.
Newest generation.
Is being able to get them to come into something that's more familiar, right? Everything we do is on a phone. We have an app for everything on phones, tablets. We do everything in that format. So somebody coming into an organization that has to sit in a control room behind a desk, flipping switches, looking at dials is not necessarily, appealing to them. So that's one aspect. But then you take the people who may be pushing back on some of these, who have a lot of tribal knowledge within the organization, then you leverage them as experts. So they can sit in a control room or controlled environment or an administration building and be able to provide advice and connectivity in an advisory way to those who are out in the field, accessing them as resources.
Yeah, that's good. I like that blend of kind of the young and the veteran.
Right.
And bringing them together. That's useful. So I'm imagining, as people are listening into this, they're also thinking about, like, what are the specific technologies that are in play here? So, how are you bringing those to light? Which technologies are you looking at to make connected workers successful today?
Yeah, and unfortunately, you can't buy a box of connected workers.
Right.
All right, there's a lot of aspects to this, from the connectivity. Are they going to use Wi-Fi? Is it going to be private LTE? There are things like LoRaWAN. There are other technologies that bring all the wireless environment together. But then there's the integrations to the applications, the back-end applications like the ERP systems, the maintenance programs, something like maybe IBM Maximo. There's all these applications that are out there that need to be communicated with. And then the enterprise side of applications that integrate things like supply chain and ordering and procurement so that they can connect this all together. So from a technology perspective, it's anything they're probably using in the enterprise, in addition to some of the specific OT technologies that they have, and everything being founded under or over the security aspect, right? Because that has to be paramount in all these things.
Well, I was going to ask about that too. Like, that is significantly increasing that security footprint, right? Or the attack surface, if you will. So I'm assuming security is a big aspect of this too.
Yeah, in the old days, if you want to talk about that, it was security by obscurity or security by disconnection, because everything was what they would be air gapped. But the air gap is kind of a faulty sense of security, especially now with technology, because you can have somebody walk into an air-gapped facility or air-gapped data center with a USB drive, and now you've defeated the whole idea of an air gap. One of the worst examples, I just anecdotally point out that I was with a customer at a previous company, and they were talking about air gap and how secure they were, and they had this one corrosion detection software that they needed to have checked, and we started talking about how they get the data out because it was connected to the vendor. If you're air gapped, how do you get there? Oh, well, we send Neil in there with his USB drive to download the data from the server and then come back out and connect it to the internet connected servers and then upload it.
Right.
It's like, well, you're not air gapped anymore,
air gapped
right?
anymore, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they have a false sense of security. I mean, it's obviously done well over time. But as more things become integrated, more pieces of equipment and more people become connected to the internet and those resources, they need to have a better idea of how they can secure things. Unfortunately, we have a really good OT security practice here that's working on that type of thing.
Right. That's good. And I love that we can bring together all of those different aspects. You talked about software, you talked about hardware, connectivity, security, that, we can bring together that full solution, right?
Yeah, I mean, and we do have all of it, right? That's the nice thing, is be able to go into a customer and we can talk about this concept of connected worker, but then we can start peeling back the layers of the onion and talking about what pieces of technology we focus on, what are those pieces of technology that we can really help them grow into. Because that's really what it is, because a lot of these technologies they don't even have, they maybe not have seen, but they need to grow into them and understand them.
Yeah. Well, you touched on this stuff earlier, but organizations are thinking about operational efficiencies, cost savings, improved compliance, accuracy of data, and the reporting that comes, the more real-time reporting that probably is possible. But I want you to build on that a little bit for us and tell us more. Maybe there's some specific examples that you might have in mind of organizations that are doing that well, or opportunities you see in the market for that.
Yeah,
tell us more about that.
Pulling all the data together is really the big challenge, and they have all the dissimilar components, the sensors all pushing data in. You have people pushing data in. They're taking data from weather incidents and how some of those things are working together. And that really puts a challenge in front of these organizations to how do we get all this data in one place? How can we do it? And the first thing is, oh, well, we have a data lake. Well, a lot of places have data swamps, right? So they really don't have any organization. There's no real boundaries to it. It just has this big slushy feel to it.
Yeah.
So a lot of times we have to come in and help them with that data architecture, right? How can they piece this together in some way that actually works for them and then integrate to those other applications that can get value from that data? And I think of it as the recycle triangle, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle. So get your data once, use it as many times as you can, and use that data and resulting result into other applications.
Mm-hmm. Well, I imagine that, if the technologies we're talking about are executed well, that really can create a sense of benefit to the workforce out there, right? That they feel a bit more empowered, maybe feel like they're getting their jobs done better, they're more efficient, are contributing better. So, what are some of the benefits that you see in the marketplace or that you tell clients that are important relative to, your workforce is going to be better off because of this from the worker's point of view?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, I literally just read this morning, is that there's 15% of the workforce in general, they're the ones that feel engaged. So there's 85% of the workforce who don't feel engaged in their job and what they're doing. And that resulted apparently in $7 trillion of loss of revenue and business last year. So it's impactful. So by doing something like this, you are making them feel engaged by empowering them to act on things. It could be as simple as giving them a smart device on their wrist that they can interact with a control system so that they're getting some alert instead of having somebody radio them or see it on an iPad or something similar like that. They're actually being able to interact and take that data in and be part of what's happening. And that to me is important. Not that they weren't before, but this is an immediate real-time need for them. And they feel like they're actually engaged, right? Not to use that word again, but they're really fundamental into what they're doing as part of their business.
Yeah, so it's like they can actually do something about it right here, right now, as opposed to sort of report this, up the chain of command or what have you.
Right. That's something with, walk down inspections or walk by inspections. A lot of times what you see that referred to as they'll be walking through a plant or walking through a facility and they'll notice something and then they'll actually then say, oh, I got to go talk to somebody about this. So when you think of a refinery or large petrochemical facility, that could be a 20-minute walk. So I walk out to my job site for 20 minutes, I see something, I have to turn around and walk back. Well, I mean, sure, there's push to talk, there's radio, there's things like that, but how do you really feel impactful in that? If I am there and I'm connected to something and I can take a picture and immediately contact that guy that I used to work with who is now an advisor in the administration building, that kind of starts really pulling it all together. Not only from the frontline worker who's walking around with this clipboard, but the advisor now has real impact on the job and the operations.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us, I'm interested to learn like some more specific examples of things that, you're working with clients and customers out in the marketplace, or specific opportunities that you see. Like, so tell us a couple of stories of work that you've been doing.
Some of them are around, well, one in particular is around maintenance and inspections. And this organization spends a lot of money on physical inspections because it's required by the EPA, it's required by other organizations. They're regulatory required to have these inspections, so they have to send people out. So, by having that worker being empowered by the technology, he not only is out there doing these things physically because it's required to be a physical inspection first off, so they can't change that. But when he gets there, he can be augmented with information and data about the operation he's inspecting, but also nearby areas, so that may not be on the inspection schedule at that time, but he might see something or understand something else and he could divert to that as well. That ultimately improves maintenance scheduling. More jobs get done because he's able to push something ahead as far as the tasks go, but he also then can address that other issue more quickly instead of waiting for something to happen, waiting for that red light to go off. He knows something is out of bounds, so he goes there. And the result of those changes for this particular organization could be in the neighborhood of about $25 million a year.
Wow.
So it's quite impactful.
That's substantial, yeah, for sure. It sounded like, did you have another example too that you were thinking about? Another
one around that is plant facilities. So this was more of a field location, but this one in plant facilities was enabling workers in this one in particular, they use bicycles to get around in the facility, so it's kind of humorous to see it. But it's a 3,900.
It's probably a big facility, right?
It's 3,900 acres, so they have a lot of ground to cover. But you can't have just motor vehicles running around in these areas. So, in this aspect, it was similar, but that walk-down inspection idea is when they were on their bicycles going out to wherever they needed to be, they could immediately connect and have access to what's called a mobile HMI. So they would have the HMI interface with them when they got to their workplace, so they could interact with the various pieces of equipment, and then either determine that it needed to be bumped up in a schedule for maintenance and the operational improvements, or they could then push back the schedule to like a turnaround operation. So I don't know, turnaround operations is they'll shut the entire plant down, and it's scheduled once every 3 years. It's not something that happens monthly. They're quite expensive, because one of the ones I knew of that happened 2 years ago, they spent $250 million shutting down the plant to retool it, reconnect, change feedstock, do all the things that needed to be done. But if you take it offline before that, now I have 2 outages.
Yeah.
So what this organization was being able to do is take this pump, look at the compressor. Okay, this is going to fail. So they knew predictively, because of what they had implemented, was going to fail in a month or whatever the time frame was, so they could push it to the time of when the actual turnaround was going to happen, as opposed to having an unplanned outage.
Yeah, that's cool.
And again, it's quite. $250 million is not a.
That's substantial. Yeah. And I love thinking about the scale of operations like that, right? And just the physical locations, and I'm sure you've been to many of them, and it's quite, it can be overwhelming, but it's also fascinating that systems like that work. And
it's really meaningful. I mean, $250 million shut down for 30 days. So even if you could save them 8 hours of work, well, you just saved them, what, $3 million? Right. So it's significant, especially in terms of that specific operation. When you think of the company themselves, like, $240 billion of revenue, what's a couple $100 million? Well, it's economies of scale, because you have to funnel it down to that facility is its own organization within the organization, and it's run as that way.
Yeah. Well, so I'm curious, like, as you think about the organizations that you're working with, companies out there, where are they typically on this kind of pipeline of kind of moving towards connected worker? Are they, early stage? Is it all over the board? Like, what's the current state of maturity that you see out there?
Yeah, I think what happens is they don't focus on some of the critical things they need to do first. So they get this patchy, siloed effort. Like, we need push to talk. Well, we need, this thing. We need to put LoRaWAN so we can have connectivity to these sensors. They don't look at a bigger picture. But when they do look at the bigger picture, they start to try to boil the ocean. And they say, this is going to be our flagship facility, and we're going to do all these things with it, and it's going to be everything that we're trying to do with connected worker. Well, again, a customer story. That particular customer, they hadn't even defined what flagship facility was. Not what were the outcomes, what were the KPIs they're measuring. None of the things that you would anticipate them having planned out, did they plan out. They just went into this trying to make this facility the best one they could ever have, but no way to really measure the success of that.
Yeah. Well, then that leads me to asking, like, as you're getting started with someone, a new client or customer on the market, how do you start with them? Because I know it sounds like you could look at the different tactical things they're already doing, move up to more of that overarching strategy level. So what's the right way that you engage? How do you get started with a client to talk them through it?
Sometimes it's as simple as me asking them, what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? Because you know where you are now, but what do you want to be? And then you kind of look at that as a gap analysis. Like, what are the technologies we need, but what are the capabilities we need to be able to get there? And then you back into the technologies that enable those. And that enables you to pick the best technology for that capability, because otherwise you really get mired in technology. I mean, the company I was at previously, you see that happening because that's what that's what the strong suit is this specific technology, this piece of hardware, this software package, and you get wrapped around the axle and what it can do, in that you get very myopic in how you see these things. And so helping them understand the gap and what you need to do, and you can do it in stages. You don't have to do it all at once. You pick some of those foundational aspects, for example, connectivity. You need connectivity to do all this. And there is no silver bullet. And that's the other thing, too, is it becomes a little misleading, I think, from a marketing perspective, just out in the world, that, 5G is going to be our answer to everything. We just 5G everything. It doesn't necessarily work, because it's not necessarily the best for all things. So you have to talk to them, too, about how can you split that connectivity into multiple buckets, but for a single solution.
Yeah. So if you're going to get started, I'm curious if you could sort of boil that down to like two or three tips that you'd say. If somebody's want to really get started in this out there, they're listening in today, like what would you say to do? What do you think?
Well, I mean, again, having them look at it really simply, right? Like what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah.
Right. And then, okay, well, we know we need connectivity. So what types of things are we going to be using connectively? Right. And that way you can start distilling it down into what you need.
Okay.
And then you kind of work up the stack as to what do we want to integrate to, and then what do we need to be able to have at the top end of that to put it all together. But ultimately, you have to understand what it is you're trying to do. How are we going to measure the success of what we're doing, right? Everybody talks about KPIs. I mean, that's not our business necessarily is to come up with these KPIs, but we certainly could help them develop how they can meet those KPIs based on the technology we're helping them with.
Yeah, but I do like that we're thinking about it because typically those KPIs are aligned towards business outcomes that organizations want. So whether or not we help the overarching strategy for those, making sure the consulting and the advice, the technology savvy we're bringing to the table is sort of aligning with those business outcomes. Because I think too many client organizations they lose track of that, particularly in IT and OT.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is and we say this like it always sounds like an excuse, but if you're not having the conversation with the right people, they're not going to clue into what those things are. They're not going to fully grasp how some of those things work together. Not that they're not able, but that's just not a function of what they need to do. Yeah. So having the right conversations with the right people to say, okay, here's what you're trying to do, here's ways you can measure it, and continually get growth or get benefit from those things, I think is what the challenge is too, is they lose track of how they can continuously improve on the things that they're doing.
Right. Okay, well, Matt, I always like to kind of wrap our sessions with experts by asking them to look into the future a little bit. So I'm curious, if you think about the next 3 years, 5 years, or even larger, or farther out, what are you excited to see from a connected worker point of view?
I think connected worker, again, because it's so much technology, there's so many things around it. We see them already. Things like drones, I think, are going to be used much more in more specific ways. Right now, they use them for, aerial observation, leak detection, things like that. And I think that's going to be used more. I've heard talk of people having automatically deployed drones in the case of a release, so they go out and they inspect where things are going. Also, robotics. What is the dog called? I can't remember the dog. The Boston.
The Boston Dynamics.
Yes, the little dog.
Yeah.
Having that run around as doing inspections on its own so that you're not actually having people in those places. Things like fully immersive collaboration. People with things like, not necessarily the eye-covering ones, like the Meta stuff.
So more like what Microsoft was doing.
Something like that, right? Or some kind of way that they can actually be completely immersed in their environment. See control dials, see things, gauges while they're interacting with their environment. And again,
so that augmented reality experience, right?
Yeah, and having immediate access to those advisors or OEMs, suppliers that they would need to do their job.
Yeah, and I imagine some of the things you're already talking about are going to layer into AI stuff that sort of fits into these spaces too.
Right, and
having just Gen AI.
Exactly, having some kind of internal AI, right? That it's not exposed to the internet, something that they can query their own documents, own processes, own procedures, their own information, have some knowledge management around all those things that they can query internally. They know they're safe. They're going to get an answer from their information, not from some squirrely 2016.
From the entire internet.
Right, exactly.
Right, cool. Well, Matt Nalbone, thanks so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate coming out.
Yeah,
and
great.
I appreciate the reduced people, so I can have a little less security detail with me. So that's always helpful.
That's good. That's awesome. And thank you for joining us today. It's been another great WWT Experts session. Got lots more coming up on the calendar, a whole big back catalog that you can check out at your leisure. Head out to wwt.com/events and you can find the stuff that's coming, the old ones out there, and much, much more. Thanks for coming today, and we'll see you next time.